The tape seal on the cardboard box had gone yellow at the edges. The property tag, hand-printed in black marker, read, Reeves, T, case 960814, do not destroy. Somebody had written that in 1996. Somebody had placed that box on a shelf in the Grays Harbor County evidence room, and there it had sat, through administrations, through renovations, through the retirement of everyone who had ever worked the case, until a cold case detective named Sandra Pruitt pulled it down on a Tuesday morning in February 2024 and cut the tape with a box cutter and looked inside. On October 14, 1996, in the logging and fishing town of Aberdeen, Washington, population 16,400, Tom Reeves had walked out of the early morning shift at the Weyerhaeuser Mill and was found dead in the gravel lot behind the VFW Hall 4 blocks away before sunrise. What happened to Tom Reeves in the last 90 minutes of his life would go unanswered for 28 years. Not because the evidence was missing, not because witnesses had scattered, but because everything needed to answer it had been sitting in that box the whole time. To understand how that happened and why it finally changed, you have to go back to Aberdeen in the autumn of 1996. And before any of that, you have to understand who Tom Reeves was. Aberdeen, Washington sits at the mouth of the Chehalis River, where it empties into Grays Harbor, and in 1996, it was a town that still smelled like the industry that had built it. Salt air and diesel and the faint resin of cut timber that clung to the air around the mill. The water was gray 9 months out of 12, and the rain came in off the Pacific in long sideways sheets that people who grew up there stopped noticing after a while. The hills to the east were Douglas for going up as far as you could see, and the men who worked those hills and the mills that processed what came out of them were the kind of men who showed up on time, clocked in without complaint, and didn't ask for much beyond a fair wage and a cold beer at the end of a long shift. Tom Reeves had been one of those men for 16 years. He was 41 years old in the fall of 1996. A mill equipment operator who had hired on at Weyerhaeuser straight out of high school and learned the machinery the way some people learn music, by feel, by repetition, until it became second nature. His supervisor would later tell investigators that Tom was the person you called when something broke, and nobody could figure out why. He had a way with the equipment that was hard to describe. He just understood how things worked. Outside the mill, Tom was a father of 2, a 17-year-old son named Danny, and a 14-year-old daughter named Lori, who lived with their mother, Tom's ex-wife Karen, in a house on Sumner Avenue, about a mile from the waterfront. Tom had a small rental on Market Street, a 10-year-old Ford Ranger, and a Friday night bowling league at the alley on Wishka Street, where he bowled on a team with 3 other mill workers, and took it more seriously than any of them would admit. He brought his kids to every home game of the Aberdeen Bobcats football season and sat in the same bleacher section with the same men from the mill every year since Danny started playing in the 7th grade. He kept a jar of change on his kitchen counter, quarters and dimes, mostly, that he was saving up to take Danny and Lori to see a Mariners game in Seattle before Danny graduated. He had been saving that jar for 2 years. He was getting close. His co-worker, a man named Phil Esposito, who had worked the same shift with Tom for 11 years, would say afterward that the last time he saw Tom alive was at the end of the 2 a.m. shift on October 14, 1996, when Tom had stopped at Phil's locker on the way out and asked him if he wanted a ride. Phil had driven himself that night. He said no. Tom said he'd see him Thursday. He zipped up his jacket against the rain and walked out the mill door into the dark. He never made it home. October 14, 1996 began like most October mornings in Aberdeen, cold, wet, the kind of gray that settled in before dawn and didn't lift until noon if you were lucky. The shift at the mill turned over at 2 a.m. a.m. By 2:15, the parking lot had mostly cleared out. At 4:47 a.m., a man named Roy Tanaka, walking his dog along the alley behind the VFW Hall on Simpson Avenue, found Tom Reeves on the ground near the back fence. He called 911 immediately. Officers arrived within 6 minutes. Tom was 41 years old. He was still wearing his mill jacket and his work boots. His wallet was in his back pocket, cash and cards untouched. His keys were on the ground nearby. This was not a robbery. The Grays Harbor County Sheriff's Office launched a full investigation that morning. The lead detective was a 20-year veteran named Gil Harmon, who knew Aberdeen the way you know a place you've worked for 2 decades. The rhythms of it, the geography, the way people talked, and what they didn't say. He processed the scene thoroughly. He collected everything: fibers, a partial boot print in the gravel, a cigarette butt near the fence line, and a small quantity of biological trace evidence recovered from Tom's jacket and hands. All of it went into evidence bags. All of it went into a cardboard box. The box went onto a shelf in the property room at the Grays Harbor County Sheriff's Office. The 911 call gave investigators their first lead. A woman who lived in the apartment building that backed up to the alley had told the dispatcher that she'd heard voices. 2 men, she thought, one of them angry, sometime around 3:30 a.m. She wasn't certain of the time. She hadn't looked at a clock. When investigators went back to interview her, she was shaken, and her account had contracted. She wasn't sure of the time, wasn't sure how many voices, wasn't sure what she'd heard. Detective Harmon wrote it down carefully and noted the uncertainty. Within the first 2 weeks, investigators identified a person of interest, a man named Dennis Cahill, who had a history of disputes with Tom, going back 18 months over money owed from a private equipment job Tom had done on Cahill's property. Cahill had no alibi for the early morning hours of October 14th. He was brought in for questioning, interviewed twice, and released. There was not enough physical evidence to charge him. His boots were seized and examined. The tread did not match the partial print in the gravel. He had no connection to the cigarette butt. Without more, the case could not move forward. Phil Esposito, who had worked beside Tom for 11 years and who had told him he'd see him Thursday, took it the way men in mill towns take grief, quietly and without public display. He went back to work the following week. He asked about the investigation every time he saw a deputy in the parking lot. He got the same answer for months: "We're still working it." By the spring of 1997, the investigation had gone quiet. No charges had been filed. Dennis Cahill remained a person of interest in the case file but had not been charged. The physical evidence gathered at the scene, the fibers, the boot print casting, the cigarette butt, the biological trace, sat in the box in the property room. In 1996, the DNA analysis technology available to small county departments in the Pacific Northwest was limited and expensive. Biological trace evidence required a known comparison sample to test against. Without a suspect in custody, without a court order compelling a sample, there was nowhere to send it. The evidence was logged, preserved, and shelved. The case file was formally reclassified as inactive in January of 1999. Tom's daughter Lori was 17 years old by then. His son Danny had turned 21 and taken a job at the same Weyerhaeuser mill where his father had worked. By 2001, 5 years had passed, and the jar of quarters on Tom's kitchen counter had been emptied long ago. His belongings packed up and distributed by the family in the months after his death. Karen Reeves, Tom's ex-wife and the mother of his children, had made her peace with the investigation, the way people make peace with things they cannot change. Not by accepting them as right, but by learning to carry them without being crushed. By 2005, nearly a decade on, Danny Reeves was working the same shift his father had worked and driving home the same roads in the dark. He had asked the sheriff's office about the case 3 times in the intervening years and received the same careful answer. The case was inactive, but not closed. He wrote it down each time, the way his mother had told him to write things down, and filed it in a folder at home. By 2010, Dennis Cahill had moved to Tacoma. He was 64 years old, remarried, working as a handyman. He had not been charged with anything. His name sat in the case file 20 miles away in a box in a shelf in Aberdeen, attached to an open investigation that no active detective was currently working. By 2016, 20 years had passed. The mill where Tom had spent his career went through another round of layoffs. Phil Esposito had retired the year before, after 31 years on the line. He still lived in Aberdeen. He still thought about Tom. He had a photograph on his refrigerator at home, taken at a bowling league championship in 1994. Tom holding the small trophy they'd won, laughing, looking like a man who has just done something worth celebrating. Phil had never taken it down. In 2021, Grays Harbor County established a formal cold case unit, a 2-person team assigned to review inactive cases using current investigative resources and technology. The unit was led by Detective Sandra Pruitt, a 38-year-old former Seattle PD homicide detective who had moved her family to the coast and taken the county position specifically because she wanted to do this work. She began pulling files in the order they had gone inactive. Case 960814, Reeves T., came up in late 2023. She read the file over 2 evenings. On the 3rd day, she went to the property room. The box was still there. Before we continue, every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now, let's get back to Tom. Detective Pruitt cut the tape on case box 960814 on a Tuesday morning in February 2024. She photographed the contents before touching them. She laid each item out on an examination table in the order they had been collected. The fiber samples in their sealed packets, the plaster cast of the boot print wrapped in brown paper, the cigarette butt in its evidence vial, the swabs of biological trace material sealed in their original containers and stored at the correct temperature in the property room's cold storage section for 28 years. 28 years. The swabs were still viable. She submitted the biological trace samples to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory for full forensic DNA analysis, a process that in 1996 would have required weeks of costly work on a single profile with no database to check it against. In 2024, it took 11 days to produce a complete DNA profile and run it through CODIS, the national DNA database maintained by the FBI that now holds profiles from millions of convicted offenders, arrestees, and crime scenes across all 50 states. The process is straightforward to explain. Every DNA sample produces a unique genetic profile, like a fingerprint made of chemistry, and CODIS compares that profile automatically against every other profile in the system until it finds a match or confirms there is none. On the 11th day, it found a match. Detective Pruitt was in her office when the notification came through. She read the name. She looked it up in the case file. She had read the file twice, and she recognized it immediately. The profile from the biological trace on Tom Reeves's jacket belonged to a man named Dennis Cahill. The same Dennis Cahill who had been questioned and released in October 1996. The same Dennis Cahill whose boots had been checked against the partial print and cleared. He had been in the system, a CODIS profile added following a felony arrest in Pierce County in 2007, more than a decade after Tom's death. That profile had been sitting in the national database for 17 years. The biological evidence from Tom's jacket had been sitting in the Aberdeen property room for 28 years. Nobody had ever put them together, because nobody had submitted the evidence for comparison until Sandra Pruitt cut open a cardboard box on a Tuesday morning and decided to find out what was inside. Detective Pruitt called the Grays Harbor County Sheriff. She called the prosecutor's office. She called Danny Reeves that same afternoon. He was 45 years old and working a day shift at the mill. She reached him on his cell phone. When she told him there had been a development, he went very quiet. "Tell me," he said. She told him. The call lasted 14 minutes. Dennis Cahill was 77 years old and living in a 2-bedroom house in Tacoma when detectives arrived on the morning of April 11, 2024. He had lived in that house for 9 years. His neighbors described him as a man who minded his own business, kept his yard tidy, and occasionally helped people with small repairs. He had a dog, a black lab named Archie, who was in the front yard when the cars pulled up. Cahill came to the door himself when the bell rang. He saw the detectives standing on his porch. He looked at them for a long moment without speaking. One of the detectives told him they were there to talk about Aberdeen. Cahill said nothing. He stepped back from the door. He was placed under arrest at 9:38 a.m. In the weeks that followed, the investigation that Detective Pruitt assembled from the original 1996 file and the new forensic results told a story that the original investigation had come within inches of seeing. Court documents confirmed that the biological trace on Tom Reeves's jacket was a DNA match to Dennis Cahill, with a statistical certainty that prosecutors described as definitive. The partial boot print in the gravel, which had been cast and preserved and compared only to the boots Dennis Cahill was wearing when he was first interviewed, was re-examined against a different pair of work boots recovered from Cahill's Tacoma property. Boots consistent with a style Cahill had owned in the 1990s. The tread matched. 2 pieces of evidence, both collected in 1996, both sitting in a box for 28 years. In Aberdeen, the reaction to the arrest moved in the particular way that small-town reactions move, through the diners and hardware stores and union halls, from person to person, carrying the same disbelief. People who remembered Tom Reeves remembered that the case had never been solved. Some of them had known Dennis Cahill. Some of them had worked beside him. The disbelief was real, and then it was replaced by something harder and quieter, the way it always is when the mask comes off a face you thought you recognized. Phil Esposito learned about the arrest through a phone call from a former coworker. He was 70 years old by then, retired, living 15 minutes outside Aberdeen. When he heard the name, he set the phone down on the kitchen table and sat there for a while. "I always thought it was him," he told a friend later. "I just never thought we'd be able to prove it." In November 2024, Dennis Cahill pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. At sentencing, he offered no statement. He was led from the courtroom without looking at the family in the gallery behind him. Danny Reeves and Lori Reeves, 45 and 42 years old, both of them with families of their own now, attended every hearing. They sat together. They left together. They did not speak to reporters. There is a photograph of Tom Reeves taken in the summer of 1996, a few months before he died. He is at the bowling alley on Wishka Street, the one where he played on Friday nights, and he is holding up the small championship trophy from the league finals. He is laughing. The kind of laugh that suggests something genuinely funny just happened, not the performed kind. He is wearing his mill jacket because he came straight from work and didn't have time to change. His son Danny is standing next to him, 16 years old, nearly as tall as his father, grinning with the particular pride of a boy whose dad has just won something. That was Tom Reeves, a man who showed up on time, fixed what was broken, saved quarters for a Mariners game, and was walking home in the dark when someone took the rest of his life from him. After the sentencing, Lori Reeves released a brief written statement. She did not address Dennis Cahill. She spoke about her father, and about Detective Sandra Pruitt, and about the property room in Aberdeen where a cardboard box had sat on a shelf for 28 years with the answer inside it. She wrote, "I don't want to spend too much time being angry that it took this long. I want to spend it being grateful that someone finally opened the box." Grays Harbor County subsequently allocated additional resources to its cold case unit, allowing Detective Pruitt's team to expand from 2 detectives to 4. As of early 2025, the unit had identified 18 additional inactive cases containing unsubmitted biological evidence. Lori Reeves's statement, read into the county commissioner's budget record, was cited as part of the rationale for the funding. How many other unsolved cases in this country have evidence sitting in boxes on property room shelves, already collected, already preserved, waiting for someone to submit it? What does it mean that it took a cold case review, 28 years later, to do what could have been done with the technology available by the early 2000s? And when justice finally arrives that late, is it still justice? Or is it something else? Something we don't quite have a word for yet. Leave your thoughts below. We read every one. Justice found Tom Reeves after 28 years. Stories like his are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe. More cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.